People in the city think a full moon in the countryside is poetic. They write songs about the silver light on the crops and the gentle midnight breeze. That's because they've never had to walk 2 miles through a towering sugarcane field at 3 a.m. carrying a rusted shovel, wondering if the sudden rustling in the stalks is a wild boar, a thief, or something that doesn't have a name. The year was 1999. I was a farmer in a small, easily forgotten village in North India. I wasn't destitute, but I wasn't rich either. I lived in that perpetual middle ground of the agricultural food chain, just comfortable enough to have something to lose, and just poor enough to spend every waking moment terrified of losing it. Back then, the electricity board played a cruel joke on us. We didn't have power 24/7. They ran it in cycles. For 1 month, the village would get electricity during the day. The next month, they would flip the switch, and we would only get power from midnight to sunrise. This was during the night cycle. And when your livelihood depends on a massive electric tube well to flood your fields, you don't get the luxury of a normal circadian rhythm. You adapt, or your crops burn in the dirt. It was around 2:30 in the morning, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but settles deep into your joints. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, lacing up my heavy rubber boots by the faint yellow glow of a kerosene lantern. Behind me, my wife suddenly sat bolt upright. She was a deeply devout woman, the kind who kept a small temple in the corner of the room and genuinely believed that a lit incense stick was a valid defense mechanism against the universe. "Don't go," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. I had a dream. I saw a shadow standing over the tube well. It wasn't human. Please, just skip the watering tonight. I let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Look," I said, gently prying her fingers off my arm. "If the devil is waiting for me at the tube well, tell him to take a number. He's gonna have to wait in line behind the bank manager, the fertilizer distributor, and the tax collector." She didn't laugh. She just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You don't respect the things you can't see. One day, that arrogance is going to get you killed." "I respect the fact that if the wheat doesn't get watered, we don't eat," I replied, standing up and grabbing my heavy wooden staff, my lathi, and a cheap, heavy metal flashlight. Before I walked out, I glanced over at the small cot in the corner of the room. My daughter was fast asleep, clutching a frayed blanket, completely oblivious to the crushing weight of the adult world. You look at your kid sleeping like that, and suddenly, walking into the pitch-black freezing night doesn't seem like a choice anymore. It's just gravity. You just do it. I told my wife to go back to sleep, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and stepped out into the village. A North Indian village at 3 a.m. is a graveyard of mud, brick, and silence. The villagers went to sleep shortly after sunset. There were no street lights, no ambient glow from televisions or passing cars, just absolute, suffocating darkness, broken only by the narrow, weak beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog. The silence was so heavy it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dry dirt lanes. The air smelled of old cow dung smoke, damp earth, and winter frost. I walked past the sleeping houses, their doors bolted shut, and exited the boundary of the village. Once you leave the village, you have to take the Pagdandi, a narrow, elevated dirt path that snakes its way between miles and miles of open fields. On either sides of me, the crops stood tall and black against the night sky, waving very slowly in the wind. I had walked this path 1,000 times, but that night the air felt stagnant, like the atmosphere holding its breath before a massive storm. I was about halfway to my tube well when the beam of my flashlight caught something sitting dead center on the narrow dirt path. I stopped. It was a matki, a small, earthen clay pot. It was tied shut with a piece of dirty crimson cloth. Scattered around the base of the pot were half a dozen squeezed lemons, a handful of rusty iron nails, and a thick ring of bright red vermilion powder thrown into the dirt. A totka, or black magic. Now in the countryside, if you see a hex like this on a crossroads or a path, the golden rule is simple. You step around it. You don't look at it, you don't acknowledge it, and you certainly don't touch it. The belief is that whoever steps over it absorbs the curse, disease, or evil entity that was trapped inside the pot. I looked at it, and I didn't feel fear. I felt an overwhelming wave of irritation. Some petty, jealous idiot in the village was probably trying to curse their sister-in-law for a property dispute. Or maybe it was a rival farmer trying to hex someone's cattle, and they decided to leave their supernatural garbage right in the middle of my walking path. I didn't step around it. I didn't say a prayer. I walked right up to it, pulled my heavy rubber boot back, and kicked that clay pot as hard as I humanly could. The pot shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, exploding into a cloud of ash, black lentils, and dried bones that scattered into the dark fields. "Clean up your own damn mess," I muttered to the empty night. I kept walking, my boots grinding the broken clay into dust. But the moment the pot broke, the wind stopped. It just died, completely and instantly. The tall sugarcane stalks on either side of me stopped swaying. The crickets, which had been chirping in a deafening chorus, went completely dead silent. A sudden, vicious drop in temperature hit my face. It felt like walking into a freezer. I paused, shining my flashlight into the crops. The beam penetrated maybe 10 feet before the dense stalks swallowed the night completely. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. I shook my head, blaming the cold, and picked up my pace. About 15 minutes later, I reached my field. The small brick pump house stood in the center, casting a long, imposing shadow under the moonlight. I walked in, grabbed the heavy iron crank, and manually jump-started the massive diesel engine. The engine roared to life, aggressively loud, spitting a thick cloud of black diesel smoke into the air. The massive pipe began vomiting hundreds of gallons of dark, freezing water into the irrigation channels. The mechanical noise was comforting. It was man-made. It drowned out the eerie silence into the fields. I walked out of the pump house, pulled a woven rope cart out into the open, and sat down. I pulled my thick shawl tight around my shoulders, struck a match, and lit a cheap beedi. The harsh tobacco burned my throat, but it grounded me. I laid back on the cot, resting my hand on my heavy wooden staff. I had about 2 hours to kill before the fields were flooded and the sun came up. I closed my eyes, ready to steal a quick nap. I didn't know it yet, but my wife had been absolutely right. There was something waiting for me in the dark, and by kicking that pot, I had just opened its front door. There's a specific kind of sleep you get when you're freezing and operating heavy machinery. It's not rest, it's just your brain shutting off the circuit breakers for a few minutes so you don't die of exhaustion. I was drifting in and out of that shallow, miserable sleep on the cart, the rough rope digging into my back through my jacket. The diesel engine was roaring a few feet away, vibrating the ground beneath me. I must have been asleep for about an hour when the cold finally bit down hard enough to wake me. My joints ached as I sat up. I struck another match, lit another beedi, and grabbed my heavy flashlight. I needed to check the irrigation channels to make sure the water was flowing evenly and not flooding a single patch of dirt. I clicked the heavy metal flashlight on. The pale, yellow beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across my flooded field. The water looked like a sheet of black glass reflecting the moonlight. Everything was fine, or so it seemed. But as the beam swept past the boundary of my field and into the neighboring plot, a stretch of land owned by a miserable old miser named Ramesh, the light caught something. About 100 yards away, standing dead center in Ramesh's wheat, was a figure. It was pitch black, just a silhouette, absorbing the meager light from my torch. It looked tall, unnaturally tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and painfully thin. It had no discernible features, no face, no reflective eyes, just a ragged outline that looked like it was draped in tattered rags. I kept the beam locked on it for a solid 30 seconds. It didn't move or flinch. It didn't even sway in the wind. "Ramesh, you cheap bastard," I muttered, taking a drag of my beedi. I figured the old man had finally lost his mind and erected a massive, terrifying bijuka, or a scarecrow, in the middle of the night to keep the wild boars away, or more likely, to keep neighbors from cutting through his property. My brain did exactly what it was trained to do. It categorized the anomaly as a nuisance, filed it under not my problem, and moved on. I was a farmer, working a 14-hour day on 3 hours of sleep. If Ramesh wanted to build a 6-foot-tall stick demon in his field, that was his business. I wasn't getting paid to critique agricultural art. I clicked the flashlight off, pulled my shawl over my head, and laid back down on the cot. "Let the boars eat it," I whispered, closing my eyes. I drifted off again, but this time the sleep was jagged, uneasy. I kept dreaming of that shattered clay pot on the dirt path. In the dream, the broken pieces of clay were slowly dragging themselves across the dirt, trying to put themselves back together. I woke up with a sharp gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the air had changed. The diesel engine was still running, but it sounded muffled, choked, like it was struggling to pull oxygen out of the freezing air. I sat up, gripping the edge of the cot. My instincts, honed from decades of sitting in the open wild, were screaming at me. The hair on the back of my neck was standing at attention. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on. I swept the beam across the water, across the mud, and brought it back up to Ramesh's field. The scarecrow wasn't in his field anymore. It was in mine. It had crossed the property line. It was now standing about 50 yards away from my pump house. I froze. The beedi slipped from my fingers and hissed as it hit the wet mud. Scarecrows don't pull up their own wooden stakes, wade through ankle-deep freezing water, and close 50 yards of distance while you take a nap. I kept the beam absolutely perfectly centered on it. It was still facing me. It still had no face. It was just a towering mass of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the light of my torch. The rags hanging off its frame looked heavy, soaked in muck. It was completely, impossibly still. Now, a smart man would have realized he was out of his depth. A smart man would have turned off the pump, run back to the village, and waited for the sun. But I wasn't a smart man after all. I was a tired, angry farmer holding a thick wooden staff, and my brain immediately leaped to the most aggressive conclusion possible. It's a thief. Someone had wrapped themselves in black blankets and was sneaking into my field to steal the diesel from my pump's reserve tank, or to steal my tools. They were playing statues in the dark, hoping I was too drunk or too blind to notice them creeping closer. I stood up. I gripped my lathi so hard my knuckles popped. "Hey!" I bellowed into the dark. My voice was loud, violent, and echoed across the flat plains. "I see you, son of a bitch. You take one more step toward my pump, and I will break both your kneecaps and bury you in the mud." Silence. The figure didn't flinch. I waited for the thieves to panic, to turn and run. But instead, the night answered me. I heard a jackal cry in the distance. Now in the village, the cry of a lone jackal in the dead of night is an omen. It means a soul is being torn from a body. But this didn't sound like an omen. It sounded like a mockery. The crying was coming from the tall grass to my left, but the towering, black silhouette was standing dead ahead. And as the sickening, weeping sound echoed through the fog, the figure in the light finally moved. But it didn't walk. It slowly, agonizingly tilted its head to the side, at an angle that would have snapped a human spine in half. I didn't yell again. I didn't threaten it. I didn't have the courage. The heavy wooden staff in my hand suddenly felt like a useless twig against a hurricane. I realized, standing there in the freezing mud, that I had kicked the matki, and whatever was trapped inside that pot hadn't scattered into the wind. It had followed me to work. When you spend your whole life working the earth, you learn to trust your tools. That diesel pump was a monstrous, beautiful piece of Western-designed engineering. It was loud, it was violent, and it never failed. Until that exact moment. The engine choked, gasped like a drowning man, and died. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of noise. It felt heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. And then the weeping stopped. I was still standing by the rope cot, the heavy flashlight gripped in my left hand, the wooden staff in my right. The beam of light was still locked on the towering, ragged silhouette standing 50 yards away in the freezing water. Its head was still tilted at that grotesque, broken angle. "Okay," I whispered to myself, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "Okay, you've had your fun. I'm going to start the pump, and you're going to get off my land." I didn't believe a word of it. I was talking just to prove to myself that my vocal cords still worked. I took one step backward toward the brick pump house. My rubber boot squelched in the mud. The figure didn't take a step. It didn't wade through the water. It just slid. 1 second, it was 50 yards away. I blinked, a completely involuntary split-second blink to clear the freezing wind from my eyes. When my eyelids opened, it was 20 yards closer. There was no splash, no sound of movement. It just dragged forward through the fabric of the dark like a shadow stretching across a wall. My stomach dropped so hard I felt physically sick. The rational part of my brain, the part that worried about bank loans and wheat yields, completely shut down. The primal, lizard part of my brain took over, and it was screaming a very simple command: run. Run right now. I took another step back. My hand was shaking so badly, the beam of the flashlight was vibrating across the water. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of a rotting animal. It was the exact same smell that had unleashed when I kicked that clay matki on the dirt path. It smelled like sulfur, dried blood, burnt hair, and cheap, bitter vermilion powder. The stench was so thick, it tasted metallic on the back of my tongue. I gagged, raising my arm to cover my nose, and in that split second, the flashlight beam dipped toward the ground. When I snapped it back up, the figure was gone. The patch of flooded field 20 yards ahead of me was completely empty. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the pump house. Nothing, just the rusted iron pipes and the red brick wall. It was behind the structure. It was circling me. Now, a lot of people in the city watch horror movies and yell at the screen, "Why did he drop his weapon? Why didn't he run?" I'll tell you why. Because when you are standing in a flooded field in the middle of a pitch black winter night, running is a death sentence. The mud is thick, the water hides deep trenches, and if you trip and twist an ankle in the dark, you are done. You are trapped on the ground with whatever is hunting you. I backed up until my spine hit the cold, rough bark of the old neem tree at the edge of my field. I raised the heavy wooden staff, holding it like a baseball bat. I swept the flashlight wildly, left, right, center. "Come on," I screamed, my voice cracking. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was pure, unadulterated panic. "Come on, show yourself." Of course, the batteries. I had been meaning to change those cheap Eveready batteries for 3 weeks. "Perfect," I whispered. I was blind. The moon had slipped behind a dense bank of winter clouds. I couldn't see my own hand gripping the staff. I pressed my back against the neem tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. The stench of burnt hair and vermilion was overpowering. It was so close, I could feel the unnatural, freezing cold radiating off it. Then I heard it breathe. It was right next to my left ear. It sounded wet, heavy, and struggling, like a pair of punctured lungs trying to drag air through a throat full of mud. I didn't turn my head. I knew if I looked at it, if I acknowledged whatever was standing next to me in the dark, my mind would simply snap. I stared straight ahead into the black void of the field. A hand reached out from the darkness and gently rested on my shoulder. But it wasn't a human hand. The fingers were impossibly long, maybe 7 or 8 inches, and they were freezing. Not just winter cold, but the kind of cold that burns your skin, like dry ice. The nails dug slightly into the thick wool of my shawl, and then a voice whispered in my ear. It wasn't the warped, demonic voice you would expect. It was worse. It was my wife's voice. "I told you not to go," the voice whispered, but the cadence was entirely wrong. It was flat, mechanical, and disjointed, like a parrot mimicking words it didn't understand. You don't respect the things you can't see. I didn't think, nor did I pray. I swung the heavy wooden staff backward with every single ounce of strength I had in my body. The wood connected with something solid, but it didn't feel like flesh and bone. It felt like hitting a hollow, rotting tree trunk. The impact sent a violent shock wave up my arms, and the staff completely shattered in my hands. The thing let out a sound, a high-pitched, metallic screech that sounded like a train braking on rusted tracks. I didn't wait to see what I had hit. I dropped the broken stick, threw the useless flashlight into the mud, and ran. I abandoned my pride. I abandoned the pump, the crops, and the tools. I didn't care if Ramesh claimed the land. I didn't care if the bank took the house. I hit the flooded field, my heavy rubber boots churning through the knee-deep water and mud. I tripped over an irrigation ridge, face planting into the freezing, filthy water. I swallowed a mouthful of mud, choked, spit it out, and scrambled up on all fours like an animal. I could hear it behind me. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was just keeping pace, herding me toward the edge of the property. I burst through the tall sugarcane stalks, the sharp leaves slicing across my face and hands, drawing blood. But I didn't feel the pain. The adrenaline had turned my blood into rocket fuel. I broke through the tree line and hit the elevated dirt path. I ran toward the village, my lungs burning, my chest heaving. And as I ran past the exact spot where I had shattered that clay pot earlier, I saw something in the pale moonlight that stopped me dead in my tracks. The pieces of the matki, they weren't scattered anymore. Someone or something had swept the shattered clay, the dried lemons, and the bones into a perfectly neat little pile in the center of the path. And sitting on top of that pile was the heavy metal flashlight I had just thrown into the mud half a mile away. It was turned on, emitting a weak, dying yellow beam pointed directly toward the safety of the village. It was telling me to leave, and it was letting me know that it could have taken me whenever it wanted. I didn't look back. I ran the rest of the way to the village, locked the heavy wooden door of my house, and sat on the floor with my back against the wood until the sun came up. I never worked the night cycle again. I hired 2 farmhands from a neighboring district to water the fields after dark, and I paid them twice. I never told them why, because out here in the countryside, ignorance isn't just bliss. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you alive.